Have you ever looked at a list of rules and just instantly felt the urge to break them? Honestly, it's like human nature fundamentally resists being told what to do. For centuries, the Ten Commandments have been viewed by so many people as this ultimate list of restrictive, archaic demands. Like a heavy, burdensome chain meant to just keep humanity in check. But what if we've been reading them completely upside down? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to completely reframe the Decalogue. We're going to shift the paradigm from a rigid list of restrictive rules to a beautiful, life-saving relational roadmap. So to truly understand the purpose of these ancient laws, we first have to ask ourselves, why does modern culture feel this massive, visceral need to rewrite them? Well, a fascinating article on CNN recently reported on a contest driven by this exact impulse. Two atheists organized a competition, and they asked a pretty provocative question. What if Moses had just turned to the Israelites and asked, hey, what do you guys think we should do, instead of actually receiving the law from God? Okay. Let's dive into this for a second. They called this initiative the 10 Non-Commandments Contest, and get this, they even offered a $10,000 prize for the best modern alternatives to the biblical Decalogue. The winning entries heavily emphasized modern autonomy. They included ideas like, be open-minded to new evidence, every person has the right to control their own body, and God is not necessary to be a good person. And honestly, this perfectly establishes the modern pushback. There's this deep cultural desire out there to totally separate moral guidelines from any sort of divine authority.
But apologists like Josh McDowell argue there's actually a fundamental psychological and spiritual reality at play here. He has this famous quote. He says, rules without relationship will always lead to rebellion. Think about it. If you look at the biblical commandments without knowing the God who gave them, well, yeah, they just look like arbitrary demands. Rejecting those laws is a completely natural response when you lack a foundational relationship with the lawgiver.
To really grasp what happens when we ignore a lawgiver's instructions, consider the tragic story of the RMS Lusitania. Picture this. It's May 7, 1915. The ship is struck by a torpedo, and absolute panic ensues. A passenger named Charles Laureat observed this horrifying scene on the deck. As people rushed around, almost everyone was putting their life jackets on completely incorrectly. Some had an arm shoved through the neck hole. Others were literally wearing them upside down. Why? Because no one had bothered to read the neat little instruction signs posted all around the ship. As a tragic result, many people drowned simply because those upside-down life jackets actually pushed their heads underwater. The metaphor the sources are drawing here is super stark. The commandments aren't chains meant to drown us, they're life-saving instructions. We ignore the manufacturer's directions at our own peril.
So, that brings us right to Section 1, the relational foundation.
If we really want to understand the life-saving nature of these instructions, we have to look at this totally overlooked detail right at the beginning of Exodus chapter 20. Before a single command is given, before a single "thou shalt not" is ever spoken, God says this, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Right? So the absolutely crucial point here is that God established his relationship and his redemption of the Israelites first. The law was given to a people he had already rescued. The sources point out that the Ten Commandments were never, ever meant to be some ladder you climb to earn salvation. No, they are the pattern of life for a people who are already saved.
And the contrast here is just striking. The modern world so often views God as this cosmic dictator in heaven, right? Just arbitrarily handing down rules, trying to control us and restrict human joy. But the text actually presents him as a loving deliverer. He literally frees his people from actual physical slavery in Egypt, and then he provides instructions to ensure they can maintain and truly enjoy that freedom. These rules frame the good life, they don't prevent it.
Moving right along, let's look at Section 2, transforming our fear. To truly understand how this law functions, we need to dive into the academic depths of human nature. In a really fascinating paper from Liberty University, researcher Pamela Icasalo breaks down the origins and functions of fear in the biblical narrative. She points out that God's original, totally uncomplicated intention for human relationships was completely disrupted by the fall of man in Genesis. When sin entered the world, it introduced this highly toxic dynamic into our relationships. Suddenly, humans felt vulnerable, and fear became an ever-present reality in our decision-making and in how we interact with absolutely everyone around us.
Now, Icasalo draws a really sharp distinction between two types of fear here. First, there's the fear of man. That originates from that deep vulnerability back in the Garden of Eden. It's the kind of fear that causes us to lie, cheat, and grasp for power just to protect ourselves. But then there's the fear of the Lord, which is entirely different.
Throughout Scripture, it's described as reverence, awe, and accountability. It's this cognitive awareness of God's holiness that actually brings wisdom in life, rather than anxiety and deceit. It's a real game changer.
Building on that dynamic, Ika Salo argues that the Decalogue serves as a transitional model for human fear. By choosing to live within the boundaries of the Ten Commandments, humanity is given a literal roadmap to transition away from that toxic fear of each other. Instead, the law moderates our relationships. It overrides our instinct for endless power struggles and helps form a lifestyle totally rooted in a holy reverence for God.
Which brings us to Section 3, Matters of the Heart.
As we look closer, utilizing the teachings of Pastor Colin Smith, we find that these rules actually govern far, far more than just our surface-level actions. Let's take the first commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me." Pastor Smith highlights how these modern trinities of idolatry are constantly vying for that top spot in our lives. Things like sex, shekels, and stomach, or pleasure, possessions, and position. And hey, even good things, like football, the firm, and the family. Listen, these are all gifts from God, but the very moment any of these gifts become more important to us than the giver himself, boom, they become an idol. The law cuts right past our outward actions and evaluates the very first love of our lives.
Pastor Smith uses this brilliant metaphor to explain this. He calls it the train track of sin. We so often look at the commandments against murder or adultery or stealing, and we think, well, hey, I haven't done those, so I'm good. But those outward actions, they're just the final station at the very end of the track. Jesus made it crystal clear that the law applies to all the earlier stations too. Before murder, there's verbal abuse and hatred. Before physical adultery, there is inward lust. Before stealing, there's a heart filled with greed or laziness. So while you might never visit that final station, we have all traveled somewhere along that track, haven't we?
And if you have any doubt at all that the Old Testament law was always about the heart, just look at the 10th commandment, "You shall not covet." This is the ultimate proof. Think about it. Murder and stealing are outward actions. Your neighbor can see those. But coveting? That happens entirely in the secret place of your mind. Nobody knows your secret fantasies or your jealousies except you and God. The Decalogue was always, from day one, intended to expose our deepest, most inward desires.
All right, let's head into our final part, Section 4, the law as a mirror. So if the law exposes our hearts to this extreme degree, what is its ultimate theological purpose for us today? Well, the great reformer John Calvin famously laid out what he called the threefold use of the law. First, and most importantly, it acts as a mirror. It perfectly reflects the unyielding righteousness of God, and by doing so, it just completely illuminates our own human weakness. When we look in that mirror, we immediately realize we fall short. Second, it acts as a restraint. It curbs evil in society simply through the dread of punishment. And third, for the believer, it acts as a guide, showing us exactly what pleases our Father in heaven.
Pastor Colin Smith notes that in this framework, the law basically acts as a tutor or a mentor. It shows you this perfect standard, highlights your human limitations, and then it gently takes you by the hand and walks you directly to the grace of Jesus Christ. Because Christ is presented in the text as the only one who kept the law perfectly, believers get to rely entirely on his record, not their own. It's a huge relief.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how Jesus summarized the entirety of these massive, imposing rules. When he was asked what the greatest commandment was, he took all the law and the prophets and distilled the whole shebang into a single transformative word: love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. That is the true, beating heart behind the Decalogue. And honestly, understanding this completely reorients how we interact with everyday boundaries and moral decisions.
So let's wrap this up. When you view the 10 Commandments now, what do you see? The source material suggests that if you don't know the deliverer, you are only ever going to feel the crushing burden of a dictator's demands. But if you understand the relational foundation they describe, those same rules instantly transform into life-saving wisdom. So I'm going to leave you with this question to ponder. Are you living your life under the heavy weight of rules, or are you resting in the joyful freedom of a relationship?